Welcome to my channel Sinister Empires. The valley breathed a slow, patient fog that morning, as if the land itself held its tongue waiting for judgment. Rice terraces tiered into the hillsides like folded scrolls. Streams threaded the fields, and the village of Hyzen clung to the river's bend with the same stubbornness as the pottery kiln at its heart. For generations, the villagers had done the same things in the same order. Rise, pray at the small shrine, tend the fields, repair roofs, and carry the children safely through storms. They lived within rules older and sharper than weather, one of the sharpest being the social law that split people into two worlds, those who wore two swords and those who did not. Aiko was of the latter world, and within it she was quietly remarkable. She had the patience of someone who knew the slow truths of clay, how to wait for water to find its place in the earth, and how to coax beauty from a lump of mud. Her hands were stained with ash, and her fingernails always scarred from kiln work. She was not a woman of idle chatter, nor brazen complaint, but those who knew her noticed an alertness about her, an eye that watched the world like an alarm, a mouth that did not melt into an automatic bow. Grandmothers tucked warnings into lullabies about girls who spoke too loud, but Aiko's voice often sounded like an extra thread of honesty in a cloth woven thin by fear. The autumn, when the story that would break her life into pieces began, a small merchant caravan passed through Hyzen on its way to the western roads. It brought fabric, salt, rare sweets, and travelers with stories that drifted the way smoke does, here then gone. Among the caravan was a contingent of samurai, not high lords, but retainers and trainees. Their armor polished, but their eyes not yet ranked by age or wisdom. Young samurai often carried the worst of their class's entitlement, a raw belief that their word was the law, and that any contradiction was a personal affront. Takeshi was one such trainee. He walked like a man testing the weight of his own future, chest a promise and voice a blade. He lingered by the kiln for reasons he would later try to explain as curiosity and art, how clay took the light, how glaze hugged a curve. But in truth he had noticed Aiko the way light notices glass. He began to comment when the caravan lodged for 3 nights. He made small requests, her to show a certain technique, her to repair a chipped cup, her to fetch water. At first, Aiko complied with the calm courtesy of a woman who knew how to survive a tension that tasted of command. But she did it on her own terms, drawing a line that was not of rudeness, but of self-respect. Where others might have smiled and folded into the request, she replied plainly and protected herself with quiet answers. On the 3rd night, when sake loosened tongues and armor loosened restraint, Takeshi returned to the kiln, having drunk more than duty allowed. A candle guttered inside the small house. The village was asleep. What happened in that hour would be reported later in pieces, stitched together in conflicting threads. Takeshi would say Aiko insulted him before the men, that she called him a fool, that she mocked the Takeda crest engraved on his shoulder. Aiko would say she quarreled with no man that night. She had been finishing a glaze and logging the temperature, and when he entered, she had asked him to leave the kiln to its work. The truth that mattered in the end was not what occurred, but who spoke it afterward. By dawn, gossip became accusation. In Hyzen, no trial compared to the weight of a samurai's word. The magistrate in the local administrative house, himself a man woven of social equations, listened to Takeshi's complaint with an immediate deference that mocked the villagers' pleas. He listened less to Aiko's father, a potter whose hands were calloused, but whose life had fed the village cups for 2 decades. A woman who dishonors a samurai undermines the sacred order, the magistrate intoned. The phrase had the ring of ancient scripture. Aiko's protest, voiced with a trembling dignity, echoed into a hall where ritual and reputation always outweighed facts. Her trial lasted hours only in the villagers' hearts. The magistrate needed less than an hour to pronounce sentence. He called upon old penalties reserved for women deemed to have stained the fabric of duty and respect. They were punitive measures not only designed to punish a woman, but to teach everyone else the cost of defiance. He called them purifications. In the quiet of her cell that night, wood rough beneath her back, a fly skittering angrily against the paper wall, Aiko said to the darkness what had become the anchor of her future endurance. They may strip me of my name, my comfort, even my dignity. They may carve lessons into my flesh and my reputation, but they cannot make their lie my truth. Viewer prompt, immediately after part 1, before you continue, tell me where you're watching this from, your country, your city, maybe even your village. I want to know how far the shadows of history travel. Comment below. The Takeda magistrates list read like a litany learned by rote. Forms of abasement, ritual pathways of shame, punishments given names to bind them in memory. The elders in the village, when they later whispered the names behind the rice fences, did not do so with curiosity, but with the weight of caution. Those names had done their work for generations. They advised daughters what to avoid, mothers what to fear. Aiko had heard them beneath blankets and near hearth smoke, always as warnings, tales of Mibori, Ishidaki, in the road that wore the promise of the sword. Miburi, public shame, had many guises depending on the town and clan. In some regions, it was a seated humiliation. In others, a procession. For Heisen, Miburi meant being bound to a pole in the village square while neighbors walked past to spit and whisper. It meant the unraveling of a reputational thread in public so that private life would follow. The crime could be real. It could be invented. No procedure would ask first. The ritual itself functioned like salt on a wound, meant to preserve the flavor of social order by bittering the flesh of those who broke it. The Kubikiri no Michi, the road of beheading, was a bitter irony. It was seldom about the cleaving of neck from spine. It was a ritual that extended the terror of execution to the endurance of humiliation. The condemned walked barefoot on gravel toward an execution ground or boundary marker, each step forced and observed, while mounted samurai or footmen demanded bows as if the woman, by remaining upright, sought rebellion. The ritual degraded. For many, the idea that they might survive was not a mercy, but a mirage to be walked into despair. Ishidaki, the stone binding, was among the cruelest physically. Heavy rocks were strapped across the back or chest of the accused, and the woman was compelled to kneel in the mud for hours. It was designed to crush not only the muscles, but resolve. The slow pressure of weight and humiliation made the mind agree to submission before the body surrendered. For peasants with little recourse, the sight alone was meant to advise others that endurance would be ruin. Hiko's sentence called for all three, a sequence meant to unravel the soul in smoke and sand. Early morning took her from the cell. Her wrists were bound. A wooden shaft fastened between them left her folded, unable to rise. The magistrate's men dragged her into the square. Villagers lined the courtyard with faces turned away, but eyes eager because history had taught them to watch shame. The way farmers watch a storm. For the lesson it brings, they set the pole and left her flush with sun and humiliation. Children were told to watch and be instructed. The magistrate's presence was a spectacle of pedagogy for the social order. Sons of farmers would learn they must bow. Daughters would learn they must never wag tongues that invited swords. Takeshi watched from behind his retainers, the smirk of a young man who had made accusation and believed his position now to be proof. Aiko stood folded, but the lines of her back did not crumple into the gracelessness the samurai expected. Where the pole secured her posture, her eyes rose. The features of her face, baked under the sun and dust, hardened into calm. The jeers of some men made a noise like distant stones rolling. Women in the crowd clutched the hems of their robes, old women with faces mapped by decades of obedience. But even in their worry lived a secret admiration. Aiko's silence was not the silence of submission. It was the silence of watchfulness. When the town bell marked the midpoint of the day, guards loosed her bonds and forced her to her feet. Blood had already curdled at small blisters formed from the ropes digging into her wrists. She was given sandaled steps forward, and the ritual of the road began. Gravel bit into uncalloused soles, and every pace shredded skin where sandals left none. Samurai shouted at her to bow as they rode. A child threw a clod at her skirt. With each step, she left a mark that would dry into dust and eventually be washed away by rain. Yet those marks mattered now only because stories remember them. Takeshi walked part of the route alongside her with the cruel arrogance bred into his youth. "Your pride will be your undoing," he told her in a low voice, because cruelty lives in small phrases. You should have shown the right deference. Aiko answered without spectacle, the words more bone than fire. You mistake servitude for respect and cruelty for honor. The challenge, small as it was, made Takeshi's jaw clench. He was learning that authority without wisdom is thin armor. By the time she reached the place chosen for Ishidaki, the sun burned low. They bound the stone to her back as if fastening fate. The weight folded her knees into the dirt, pushed the breath from her lungs with the steady pressure of inevitability. The courtyard spun in and out of focus. Hours passed like old trees, slow, indifferent, bearing the witness of rings. Her father, the potter who had once molded children's laughter into clay, sat near the edge of the crowd with powdered tears, the salt of grief drying on his face as he watched his daughter's body bend under stone. It is hard to convey small mercies in those moments. A hand that slips a bowl of water unseen, a child who covers her eyes, a neighbor who will later smuggle a blanket for the night. Aiko felt each fragment of kindness like a pebble warming the inside of a shoe. When darkness began to stitch the edges of the day, her legs trembled and her lungs gasped for the air of the present moment. She remembered the quiet vow she had made when the cell smelled of mold and regret. I will not make their lie my truth. That thought, like a coiled cord inside her, thinned but did not break. It was not a spectacle of immediate triumph. The crowd dispersed when the magistrate called the punishment sufficient. They left her there with the stone, not out of mercy, but because they had fulfilled the ritual. For hours afterward, in the sour tang of night, she lay gasping and grateful for the small heartbeat of life, which somehow insisted on continuing. Night retreated like a patient animal, from the valley as the sky paled and the first birds began to map their routes. When morning came, it brought whispers circling through alleys. A rumor that, like many rumors, smelled of the possibility that something had gone wrong. A woman had bent, but not bowed into the prescribed humiliation. She had made it through the road to an extent that most did not. For a village used to simple closures, the story unsettled something under the skin of custom. Word traveled the way word always does in a hierarchical world, slowly, but with the power of a rolling drum. The Takeda administration was not indifferent to rumors that suggested incompetence in discipline. They understood that the spectacle of unyielding justice had a function that was as political as it was moral. If the people perceived leniency or imperfection, the social order risked slippage. So when news arrived that a woman under sentence had survived the stone and remained upright, a higher official was dispatched, a man named Lord Ishimori, whose reputation was colorless and sharp. He had earned a grudging regard for being a magistrate who listened to evidence and who disliked spectacle dressed as legality. Aiko was brought before him in a manner less theatrical than the previous day but more exacting. Her body still betrayed the events of the last hours, bruises, rope marks, and a gait jarred into slow steps. Ishimori watched, no dramatics. Simply the narrow, precise attention of a man who had seen the many faces of human testimony. Tell me, he asked, in your words, what happened. She inhaled and spoke with the measured cadence of someone who had once told stories to small apprentices at the kiln. She told the truth as she had lived through it, not in the complaint of vengeance, but in the calm registry of facts. When her voice touched the events, the court listened the way one listens when rain starts and then becomes a river, inevitably and with increasing attention. Ishimori then called Takeshi forward. The young samurai found himself in an interrogation that was a fine thing to watch. Questions thrown like spears, but retrieving answers that contradicted themselves under pressure. He had thought his station offered him protection. He had not measured the consequence of inconsistencies. Asked about time, about who else was present, about motive, his story curled in on itself. Where Aiko had been simple and steady, Takeshi swelled and then shrank when each question exposed a seam. When the inspector spoke his finding, it was terse and thunderous. A sentence given on the basis of unverified accusation dishonors the clan. The lies that cloak cowardice will not stand as law here. The statement hung in the room like a bell. The repercussions were immediate. Takeshi was relieved of his rank, stripped of the privileges that had been a promise of life. To be made common in a world that divides commoners and warriors is to be cut from an existence that once defined you. The news hit the young man's face like cold iron. His family, if he had family nearby, would feel the shame multiply. Aiko's exoneration was pronounced in the same breath. The magistrate offered a constrained form of restitution, a formal apology, and a directive that the village ensure some recompense. It was not enough to undo the cruelty inflicted. The weight of the stone could not be lifted from memory by a few words. Yet the verdict did something else. It carved a crack in the illusion that samurai speech was always final. When she returned to the kiln, the work of shaping clay was a small miracle of ordinary life. Her hands, which had been pressed to hearth and wheel for years, resumed the movements that had once been automatic. The simple rituals of pottery became a slow salve. Villagers watched her pass, and some murmured apologies, some silence. She accepted neither scorn nor elevation. Her eyes held the same quiet that had carried them through the torture of the previous days. The world had given her scars. She carried them like a map of what survived. Yet something had shifted that would not easily be contained. Stories travel like seeds. Aiko's endurance, her refusal to let a lie become her truth, quietly spread. Young women in neighboring villages heard about the potter's daughter who had stood to the end, and wondered in the low places of the night whether endurance always equaled inevitable ruin. Men who had been content to accept shame as social regulation began to see a fissure where courage could slip. The story itself began to carry its own pressure, a slow force against the insistent weight of hierarchy. Time has a way of settling like dust over a place after events. Weeks passed, and Heisen returned to seasonal rhythms, planting, harvest, the potter's wheel that spun a daily miracle of renewal. Yet memories remained, and Aiko's name was one that did not fall wholly into ordinary speech. Where it passed, people felt as if something unspoken might follow, a quiet question. An edge of possibility. Takeshi, stripped of rank, left the domain ashamed or enraged. History remembers him only in the way people speak of those who lack the courage to admit a mistake. For Aiko, what lay ahead was not only consequences and restitution, but the slow process of rebuilding with hands that had been made new in pain. Her father, who had once mended broken parts for a living, mended in ways that were less visible. He taught his apprentices to wash clay delicately from their fingernails, to speak to customers with a dignity that did not bow, and to tell stories that placed respect where silence had lived for too long. Lord Ishimori's verdict remained a small shock to the local machinery. It reminded the Takeda leadership that justice, if it wished to claim merit, needed to be more than theatre. It was a call, faint but persistent, that the reverence for arms should not be an excuse to forget accountability. The villagers continued to obey their obligations, but they were less likely to accept spectacle as explanation. What would remain of Aiko's story in centuries to come is the most curious part of this history. History does not always record what is obvious. It collects fragments, documents, tokens, the memory of old women who tell tale and caution both. But the essential thing is this. The punishments used against dishonored women in many places were not always implemented purely by law. They were instruments of power, of pedagogy, of private grudges dressed in public robes. In Aiko's case, the public nature of her suffering turned against those who wielded it. The cruelty revealed its own ugliness, and so, for a time, weakened its authority. Aiko returned to her small kiln and to the simple governance of work. Clay has a way of absorbing both heat and meaning. A pot shaped with steady hands bears the trace of those hands. Villagers bought the cups and bowls she made. Some looked away when they met her eyes. Others, women who watched their daughters learn balance, placed their hands in her because a small blessing could be badly needed. She never sought vengeance. Her aim was quieter. She wanted, as she had told Lord Ishimori in that small, plain voice, that truth breathe. She wanted the lie that had been imposed to be revealed as a lie so that it would be less likely to be imposed on someone else. In the years that followed, the rituals of shame were preserved in law books, remembered in grim lines of poetry, and sometimes repeated by men who insisted the world must be reminded of order. But the fact that even one woman could refuse to let a lie become her reality, entered the local law as an ember. Small, stubborn, capable of taking if it landed in dry wood. The story is not a clean triumph. Nothing wrapped in suffering ever is. But it is a story of endurance and the small ways in which personal truth can become a lever against communal injustice. Viewers, before you leave, comment your suggestions. Which empire, which dark history, which punishments or mysteries should I cover next on Sinister Empires?